Sarah, Ella, it's so great to have you both on Full Story.
Hello.
I know.
So, Ella, I'll start with you. It's been 5 years since the Black Lives Matter protests swept across the world, including Australia. It's hard to believe that it's been 5 years since then. Can you talk to me about the Australian movement and why Black Lives Matter resonated with so many here?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the Black Lives Matter movement was huge here in Australia. We saw record numbers of protesters at the marches around the country, especially in Sydney, where at least 20,000 people turned up. So we know the global movement was sparked by the death of George Floyd at the hands of police in the US. And that really did strike a chord with a lot of First Nations families here whose loved ones had died in police or prison custody.
It was a moment that was pretty incredible. As far as the eye can see, there were just people. And I'd never been to a protest on Black Lives Matter, on deaths in custody that had that kind of public support and the sentiments where everyone was talking about it. You know, we had people from all over, not just Aboriginal people, not just people of colour, that there was a huge moment of solidarity. And I think it was really electrifying being there.
And at that time in 2020, the nation was reeling from the fatal shooting of Kumanjayi Walker by Northern Territory police officer Zachary Rolfe in the community of Yuendumu. So Rolfe was charged with murder, but later cleared of all charges. But so the focus of the protests back in 2020 were really to call for action, to prevent those deaths in custody, and to demand police accountability. And when I was writing my story, looking at the 5 year anniversary of these protests, I was talking to Malilma May, who's a Larrakia Tiwi woman. She helped organise the Darwin rally, and she described it as a historic moment. She said, like, there was, felt like there was real momentum, that the community was empowered and activated and determined. But she says, looking back now, she feels grief stricken, saying things have just gone from bad to worse. So I think it feels to a lot of people that 5 years after this global movement promised a reckoning for racial injustice in Australia, the kind of grim reality facing First Nations people is eerily familiar.
Eerily familiar is a fitting description, Ella, because just last week a young Warlpiri man died in custody in the Northern Territory. What's been the reaction or response to that?
Well, devastation is the word I'm hearing over and over again from people in the Territory. So last week, the community of Yuendumu was bracing for the findings of a 2 year inquest into the death of Kumanjayi Walker when they learnt another young Warlpiri man, also from Yuendumu, had died after an altercation with police in the Coles supermarket in Alice Springs. So that man was 24 years old. He's now known as Kumanjayi White. His family say he had a disability and was under a guardianship order at the time. And we know that he lost consciousness after being restrained by police. Now, police alleged that White was shoplifting and said plainclothes officers stepped in after an altercation with a security guard. But the young man's family have really criticised police for portraying this man as a criminal while the incident is under investigation, and they want a separate investigation that's independent of police. And in terms of the emotional impact, I mean, Kumanjayi Walker's cousin, Samara Fernandez Brown, released a statement saying the community had been looking forward to truly beginning their healing process, but have now been thrown right back to the start, reopening wounds that were just beginning to scab over. So the findings of Kumanjayi Walker's inquest were due to be handed down this month. They've now been delayed while the community is in mourning. And once again, we're seeing rallies pop up all over the country in solidarity with Yuendumu.
Sarah, I want to bring you in now. We are recording this just after Reconciliation Week. This year marked the 25th anniversary since the Corroboree 2000, since the Walk for Reconciliation. It's often described as a defining moment for the country. Why was it significant for that time?
Well, this was a moment before social media, before reconciliation became the kind of buzzword that it is today. People didn't really know what that meant in relation to First Peoples and the Australian public. So it was really a campaign to get people invested in this. This came off the back of a huge amount of change during the 90s. We had the decade previously, which saw the Mabo and Wick decisions, which gave way to the overturning of terra nullius and the false notion that this was a land that belonged to no one, that it was uninhabited. We saw the Royal Commission into Black Deaths in Custody, Keating's Redfern speech, and the 1997 Bring Them Home report, which investigated the forced removal of Aboriginal children. So I think when you talk to a lot of people who were around during that period, there was a sense of optimism, of change for people, activists and advocates, and the ordinarily public were seeing a shift in public sentiment, in the mood. This bridge work saw, 250,000 people turning out in May 2000 to walk that bridge. And there was a notion that the nation was beginning to look back on its track record on First Nations issues and really see how we were going to move forward. The National Indigenous Radio Service, Rihanna Patrick, has done a fantastic episode looking at the key players and kind of walking through those people that were there and really advocated this. So I'd urge anyone who wants to have a deeper look to really listen to that.
And Sarah, you just last week, I believe, interviewed former Labor Senator Pat Dodson, who is affectionately known as the father of reconciliation. What was your biggest takeaway from your conversation with him?
So I think one of the main takeaways with Pat Dodson was that there was this notion that Australians have yet to settle the founding questions of who and what we are as a nation. The foundations of being on a contested doctrine that was legally overturned, the dispossession, the lack of treaty, the continuing impact of what he says in effect is an ongoing genocide. Australians must grapple with that, and I think that is one of the main things that Patrick Dodson really wrestled with. Dodson is, of course, a long-standing champion of reconciliation, serving in various roles, including as a commissioner on the Aboriginal Royal Commission into Black Deaths in Custody. He retired from politics in 2023 due to ill health, but he has not given up the push for reconciliation. He's urging the Prime Minister to use that resounding majority that they gained during the election last month to push ahead with treaty and Makarrata Commission, because he says that the Australian people, they voted against the referendum, which was of course on constitutional recognition. It wasn't on treaty, it wasn't on the Makarrata Commission. So he's thinking that there is some appetite for change and for practical actions on those measures.
And we will get to both Makarrata Commission and treaty a little later on. But I want to go back to the comments that Pat Dodson made about genocide. He condemned Australia's Aboriginal youth incarceration rates and child removal rates. Can you elaborate on what he told you and what he said should happen?
So he was really drawing comparisons to just the devastating amount of children who are being taken away from their families with child protection authorities. He was talking about children ending up in custody from the age of 10. Communities that their children are being removed, their cultures are being smashed, their connection to families and communities are being destroyed. And he says that is in effect tantamount to genocide.
Ella, we've talked about some of the ongoing impacts of colonisation, be it disproportionately high incarceration rates, deaths in custody, child removals. Can we say that there's been much progress since these two historic moments, since the Black Lives Matter protests 5 years ago and the Corroboree 2000 25 years ago?
Well, a lot of people feel like we're going backwards, that all that momentum from 2020 has amounted to nothing in terms of meaningful change. And I think this death in Alice Springs just last week has kind of driven that home for a lot of people. When it comes to Indigenous deaths in custody, Independent Senator Lydia Thorpe is particularly scathing about the lack of progress. And the frustrating thing for her and a lot of community is that the solutions to stop these deaths have been there for more than 30 years, when a Royal Commission made 339 recommendations to stop them. And that was back in 1991. So there was a review that suggested about 2/3 of those recommendations have been fully implemented, but that review has also been described as misleadingly positive. In that time, we've seen almost 600 Indigenous people die in these circumstances, 10 this year alone. So overall, there have been some incremental changes, most of which have happened off the back of relentless campaigning from grieving families. But the core advice from that Royal Commission was to reduce the number of Indigenous people in prison. And despite that, we're seeing several states and territories passing laws which they know will put more Indigenous people behind bars. So a lot of the campaigners I've spoken to feel like while the situation has become more urgent, the level of public support has actually dropped off, and we're just not seeing that change that the people had thought might be coming back in 2020.
I think, as Ella said, I think there's overwhelmingly a sense of frustration and anger as well as sadness that we haven't seen these improvements, and there's still extraordinarily high rates of children being removed from family. Aboriginal people are still dying in prison or police cells and supermarkets. Kumanjay White's family exemplifies this. It's two young men who come from the same community, the same family. That must be almost too much to bear for that community that has already been going through this. They've been grappling with their own trauma and loss. And Kumanjay White and Kumanjay Walker, had they lived, they would have been about the same age. Like, I think, yeah, it must be hugely, hugely traumatizing for them.
In 2022, on the night of Anthony Albanese's election victory, he opened his speech to the nation with a commitment to the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full. That is, voice, treaty and truth. How does that speech delivered in 2022 compare to the speech that he gave last month when Labor was re-elected?
Well, he began with an acknowledgement of the traditional owners, and that received loud and raucous cheers. This is something that Albanese usually does, but it took on an added layer of meaning because during the campaign, the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, had said, "Welcome to country ceremonies" or acknowledgements were overdone, which led many within the Indigenous community to accuse him of trying to start a culture war in those final days of the campaign. But aside from that, there was a real absence of any Indigenous policy during the campaign. And on election night, the only other time that Albanese mentioned Indigenous people was to commit to ongoing efforts around reconciliation and closing the gap. Although exactly what that will entail is less clear.
I think after the past few decades, governments have shifted from constitutional recognition in various forms to, the long push for treaty and truth-telling that has been going on since the beginning. But we're now seeing governments really focusing on practical measures, housing, getting people secure and safe housing, health commitments such as dialysis in the Northern Territory and healthy food subsidies in remote communities. So I think there's less of a move on that kind of symbolism and that big picture stuff, and there's more about improving the situation on the ground in communities. Talking to a lot of people, they want two of those things to happen.
Former Social Justice Commissioner Mick Gooder says there is a lack of courage on Indigenous affairs policy. What do you make of that? What are people telling you?
The overwhelming feeling among Indigenous leaders is that neither of the major parties have had the courage to pursue meaningful policies in this space since the defeat of the referendum. There's been a lot of talk, as Sarah mentioned, about focusing on practical measures, but not a whole lot of detail about what that will actually involve. One person described it to me as a long period of inertia since the Voice defeat. So we've seen some leaders coming together now, for example, in Queensland last month, to try to fill that void and refocus government priorities. And as part of that, there's been some growing calls for the federal government to take a stronger role, especially off the back of the election, to hold the states and territories accountable for failing to meet their closing the gap targets, and also for passing punitive laws that violate their human rights obligations, particularly around things like youth justice.
Sarah, Megan Davis, one of the architects of the Indigenous Voice to Parliament, said that engagement with government from First Nations communities was subject to growing exclusivity. I wonder what you make of those comments.
For a lot of Aboriginal people, coming off the back of the Voice in that campaign year, there was a huge amount of focus and attention on Indigenous issues. We were in the news all the time. I think, as Ella said, there's been a huge lack of attention since that vote was voted down. So when Megan Davis talks about that the governments need to have a wider group of people involved in these policy decisions, and there is a risk of exclusivity, I think that is a really poignant point. She thinks that, the government needs to be listening to a wider group of Indigenous people that it can't just be, I think, the same people talking. You know, she's warned against these kind of closed shop public consultations in the wake of that referendum defeat, and she said that these policy frameworks are failing and that a new approach is needed. Particularly interesting comment from Davis was she said that Aboriginal people are now saying that the no vote has been interpreted as bureaucrats and government no longer needing to listen to community voices on laws and policies. And that has a huge tangible effect on people's lives. We see that year after year with the closing the gap targets and these measures which still aren't shifting. The dial isn't really moving. So I think when we talk about bringing in new voices, new people, that these can have a really big shift on really complex policies which can improve people's lives and their children's lives.
Now, we've talked about the other elements of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Is there any indication whether the government will push forward with national truth-telling or with a treaty process, the other requests made by First Nations people?
Well, the Minister for Indigenous Australians, Malarndirri McCarthy, was asked about this on the ABC last week. She reiterated that the Labor government was committed to both these things in principle, which is a line we've heard before. But she did say the new parliament had an opportunity now to take another look at treaty and truth-telling and to see what they can do moving forward. She stopped short of making any firm commitments, though, other than promising to listen to leaders across the country. So we'll have to wait and see.
I think also when you've had people who've been advocating for a really long time for truth and treaty making, Pat Dodson, of course, making those comments, I think that'll add an added layer of pressure on the government. I think with Dorinda Cox now moving into the Labor Party, of course, she's been a strong proponent of truth and treaty making with the Greens, with a private bill. As to where that goes, I think perhaps she could advocate for more pressure from inside the party room. We'll just have to wait and see how all this lands.
Ella and Sarah, a lot of people still don't have a grasp on what truth-telling is. Why is a national truth-telling process considered to be so important?
On a broad level, to me, it's about our identity as a nation. Stan Grant described it as a mirror into our soul. We need to understand and confront the uncomfortable parts of our history, including and especially the way that historical policies have shaped the lives of First Nations people today quite directly. And on a more personal level, I think it's about healing. So many elders that I've spoken to who've been through so much and lived through, the worst types of discrimination and racism and disadvantage, have told me that they can't heal until their stories have been heard and acknowledged. So really, that's all they want, is a chance to be heard.
I think that's exactly right, Ella. As a nation, we can't truly reconcile until this happens on a broader scale. I speak to a lot of people all around the country, and there's so many views on this, but something that does come up again and again and again is that this notion that we were never reconciled to begin with. We've never dealt with this. I think for true reconciliation, we need to tell the truth about our histories, the good, the bad and the ugly, at all levels, in schools, in the universities, in media, and most of all to each other.
Sarah, Ella, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nour.